The morning the Duke of Renthorp nearly destroyed himself, the sun was shining. That was the detail Hilda George would remember longest. Not the scratch of the pen against parchment, not the trembling in his hand that he believed no one could see, but the cruel indifference of the light, pouring gold through the library windows, as though nothing in the world was about to go terribly wrong. She should not have been in that room. Maids did not enter the Duke's private library without summons. Hilda knew this. She had known it for the 11 months she had served at Renthorp Hall, moving through its marble corridors like a shadow, careful and quiet and utterly invisible. That invisibility had kept her safe. It had also, until this morning, kept her silent about things she had no safe way to say. But she had seen the document the night before. She had not meant to. She had been replacing the candles on the writing desk when the candlelight caught the edge of an open page, and 3 words in a handwriting she recognized. Though she had no business recognizing it, had stopped her breath completely. She had read enough to understand what was being taken from him. She had read enough to understand who was doing the taking. The Duke stood at the desk now, one hand braced against its edge, the other holding the pen above the signature line, with the particular stillness of a man who has already made a decision he knows will cost him everything, and has chosen to call it honor. His dark hair fell slightly across his brow. His jaw was set. His eyes, clouded since the fever 2 winters past that had stolen most of his sight, were fixed on a middle distance that held nothing he could see. He could not read what he was signing. He did not know that. And the man standing at his shoulder, his most trusted solicitor, his father's oldest friend, the man who had guided him through grief and inheritance, and the terrifying machinery of a dukedom he had inherited at 23. That man was smiling. Hilda could see it from where she stood. The Duke could not. That asymmetry was the whole of the horror. She crossed the room in 7 steps and closed her fingers around the pen. The solicitor's smile vanished the moment he felt the resistance. What on earth? Mr. Aldous Crane took 1 step forward, his voice dropping to the precise register of a man who has spent 40 years making certain people feel small. Girl, release that immediately. You have no business in this room, and absolutely none touching His Grace's correspondence. Hilda did not release it. She was aware, with the crystalline clarity that comes only in moments of genuine terror, of exactly what she was doing. She was a maid of 11 months standing. He was a solicitor of 4 decades, a man whose signature appeared on half the legal instruments in the county, whose word in any courtroom in England would outweigh hers without a moment's deliberation. She had no title, no standing, no protection beyond the walls of a secret she had been guarding for nearly 2 years. She held the pen and she did not move. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I must ask you not to sign this document." The Duke of Renthorp turned his head toward her voice, with the careful precision of a man who has learned to navigate entirely by sound. She had studied him the way one studies a landscape they know they must one day cross. 11 months of observation from doorways and corners, and the safe distance that invisibility provides. She knew he rose before the household each morning and walked the grounds alone, because the grounds he had memorized and the house was still full of furniture that occasionally betrayed him. She knew he had documents read aloud to him by Crane, and that he had disclosed the full extent of his blindness to no one outside Renthorp's walls. Because a duke who cannot read his own correspondence is a duke whose enemies begin sharpening things the moment they learn it. He was 28 years old, and he carried the weight of the dukedom with the rigid composure of a man who had decided that the world would not see him diminished. He turned his head toward her now, and his expression was not angry. It was something more controlled than anger, which was more frightening. It was the expression of a man deciding very quickly how seriously to take an inconvenience. "Who are you?" he said. "Hilda George, Your Grace, in service here since March of last year." "And what?" he said quietly, makes a housemaid feel entitled to interrupt a legal proceeding. It was a fair question. It was, in fact, the precise question she had been asking herself since her feet had carried her across the threshold against every reasonable instruction her better sense had ever given her. "The document you are about to sign," she said, "is not the document Mr. Crane read to you yesterday evening. I know what was read to you because I was in this room when it happened, replacing the candles at the far end of the desk. I heard every word Mr. Crane spoke, and what he read aloud and what is written on this page are not the same." The silence that followed had weight and temperature. Crane recovered first. His laugh was warm and paternal and completely manufactured. "Your Grace, the girl is either confused or she is in someone's employ. I would strongly recommend she be removed from the room before. What is different about?" The Duke was not looking at Crane. He had not looked at Crane since Hilda had spoken. She kept her eyes on the Duke's face and forced herself to treat this as simply a problem with a solution, the same as any other. "The clause regarding the northern and eastern properties, Your Grace. When Mr. Crane read the document to you, he described a temporary transfer of management rights, renewable each year at your discretion. What is written on this page transfers ownership outright, in perpetuity, with no provision for reversal or repurchase." She stopped. "The northern and eastern properties together represent the majority of Renthorp's income-generating land." The room was absolutely still. "Give me the document." The Duke held out his hand. Crane's laugh died. "Your Grace, a standard legal construction regarding permanent management can often resemble in its phrasing. Mr. Crane." The Duke's voice was quiet in the way of things that do not need to be loud to be final. "Give me the document." Hilda placed it in the Duke's outstretched hand. His fingers closed over it with the careful certainty of someone who has transferred his trust entirely to touch. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight and texture of it, and then he said, "Read it to me, every word, from the first clause." She read it. All of it. Her voice remained even through the standard preamble, through the property descriptions, through the buried language of the transfer clause, which she read twice without being asked, because the second reading made its meaning inescapable. When she finished, she set the document on the desk and waited. The Duke set down the pen, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man committing something to permanent memory. "Leave us," he said. Crane did not move immediately. "Your Grace, I have served this family for 40 years. If you will simply allow me to explain the legal framework that governs this kind of..." "Mr. Crane." Nothing more than that, just the name, in a tone that closed every available door. Crane gathered his coat from the chair. As he passed Hilda, his eyes met hers for the space of 2 seconds. They were not afraid, they were assessing. The eyes of a man who has not yet decided what this interruption ultimately costs him, and who is already calculating the answer. The door closed. Hilda stood alone with the Duke of Renthorp and the sunlight and the unsigned document, and she waited. "You said you heard me last evening," the Duke said. "You were replacing candles at the far end of the desk." "Yes, Your Grace. And the handwriting. You said you understood who was doing the taking." "Whose handwriting did you recognize on that document?" She had not said those exact words aloud. She had thought them the night before, alone in this room with the candlelight and the open page. She had not spoken them to anyone. She understood immediately what this meant. Crane had reported the candle incident to the Duke that morning. He had reported it with enough detail to confirm he knew she had seen the document, but he had put specific words in her mouth. Words that would frame her as someone with an agenda, someone already primed to make accusations before she could frame herself as anything at all. Crane had been managing this situation since last night. "I did not say those words aloud, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I was alone when I saw the document. Whatever Mr. Crane reported to you this morning about my presence in this room came from his own construction, of events, not from anything I said." The Duke was very still. He told me you had been muttering to yourself about knowing the handwriting, that you seemed agitated and confused. I was neither, she said. I was alone, and I was silent, and I was reading. A long moment passed. She could see him weighing it. The 40-year history of Crane against 11 months of a housemaid whose surname he had not known until 4 minutes ago. Whose handwriting? He said again. Did you recognize she made her decision? My brother's, she said. Thomas George, he was Mr. Crane's junior clerk for 4 years. He left the firm 18 months ago under circumstances described publicly as voluntary resignation. She held herself very straight. He did not resign. He was removed because he had found something in the firm's records he was not meant to find, and he brought it to Crane directly, believing it an administrative error. It was not an error. She stopped, drew a breath. 6 weeks after his removal, my brother was found at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles outside the village. The inquest recorded it as an accident. She was 22 years old, and she had said those words in her mind 10,000 times, and this was the first time she had said them aloud to anyone with the power to do something about them. How did your brother's handwriting come to appear on a document in Crane's possession? The Duke said. His voice was different now, quieter, more careful. Crane had been using Thomas to draft secondary documents. Junior clerks do much of the physical writing in a firm. The principal dictates, the clerk transcribes. Thomas's hand appears on dozens of Crane's documents over 4 years, all of them legitimate. When Crane began altering documents or creating fraudulent ones, he used the same drafting process, except that Thomas was transcribing language he didn't know was false. She paused, until he found the one document where he recognized that what he had written and what had actually been agreed were different. That was what he brought to Crane. He thought he had made an error in transcription. He had not made an error, the Duke said. No, he had made a discovery. And Crane understood the difference even if Thomas didn't. The Duke moved to the window with the memorized steps of a man who knows this room by heart. He stood with his back to her, and the sunlight came across his shoulders, and she could see in the set of them the particular weight of a man who is revising everything he thought. He knew about the last several years of his life. You came here, he said, to Renthorp Hall 11 months ago. You entered service in the household of the man whose solicitor you believed responsible for your brother's death. His voice was not accusatory. It was precise. What were you looking for? Proof, she said. I needed to find what Thomas had found, but in a form that could not be dismissed. The county magistrate has been Crane's hunting companion for 15 years. The London courts would have required money I don't have, and standing I don't possess, and a woman making accusations against a respected solicitor, with evidence gathered while in unauthorized access to a private estate, would have been dismissed inside of an hour. She met the Duke's profile steadily. I needed the case to be beyond dismissal. That required time and access and patience. It required, the Duke said, 11 months of being invisible inside the house of a man who could not see you anyway. The observation landed in the air between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. Yes, she said simply. He turned from the window. I need to see everything. Every document, every copied record, everything you found in this house. Today. His voice had taken on a different quality. Not the tone of a duke addressing a housemaid, but the tone of a man who has identified a problem and is allocating his full intelligence toward it. I am going to send to London for a barrister I trust. A man named Whitmore, who has no connection to Crane or to this county. Nothing moves through official channels until he arrives. Crane will not wait passively, she said. He knows I have seen the document. He knows I stopped the signing. Whatever he was planning, he will begin adjusting it. Then we move tonight. He crossed the desk and picked up the unsigned document and held it for a moment. This stays with me. It is evidence. And it is the one thing he cannot recover without walking back through that door. He set it down. Miss George, I am going to ask you something. and I want an honest answer. I have given you nothing else, Your Grace. Something shifted in his expression at that. How much of what you found implicates my father? She understood why he was asking. She understood what it cost him to ask it. None, she said. Your father's signature appears on several documents, but the forgeries are distinguishable to a trained eye. The genuine signatures are dated before the period of fraud. Crane appears to have begun the systematic alterations after your father's death, when you inherited and the estate accounts fell entirely under his management. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. And the fever, he said. The period when I was entirely dependent on Crane to interpret every document that came to this desk. That appears to be when the larger transfers were constructed, she said, as gently as she knew how to say it. He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a weight he had been half prepared for. My father had doubts about Crane near the end, he said. He wrote to me at university. He said he had found a discrepancy he could not account for and intended to raise it with Crane directly. He stopped. He died before he could. His heart, the physician said. Hilda looked at him across the desk. The fire had burned low. The morning had aged around them without either of them noticing. Your Grace, she said quietly. Did you believe it was his heart? He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was measured, each word placed with care. I believed what I was told by the man I had been taught since childhood to trust with everything. He turned his face toward the window. I am beginning to understand that trust and the window by which it entered my house. Whitmore needs to know about that letter, she said. Your father's letter, do you still have it? In the study. Filed under personal correspondence from my university years. He paused. I filed it myself before the fever. Crane has not touched those files. Then it is safe, she said. He looked in her direction, and it struck her, not for the first time, how precisely he had learned to orient himself toward a voice. In 11 months of moving invisibly through this house, she had never stood still long enough to be the fixed point in a room. It was a strange feeling, not uncomfortable. Stranger than that. You could have approached the London courts after finding the archive records, he said. You had enough, even without today. Why did you stay the full 11 months? Because enough is not the same as undeniable, she said. And because I had to be certain, Thomas was dismissed as confused and accident-prone and prone to misreading things that were perfectly clear. I would not bring a case that could be dismantled with those same words applied to me. She held his gaze, and because today confirmed something the archive records only suggested. The document that was nearly signed this morning is the clearest evidence that this has been ongoing and deliberate. Without today, I had history. With today, I have intent. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the quality of someone setting something down that they had not realized they were still carrying, he said, I am sorry about your brother, Miss George. They were not words of guilt. He had nothing to be guilty of. They were simply the acknowledgement of a loss that the world had recorded as an accident and moved past. And that acknowledgement, plain and unornamented as it was, moved through Hilda George's chest like the first warmth after a very long winter. Thank you, Your Grace, she said, and did not entirely succeed in keeping her voice level. Crane was discharged that same evening quietly, with 2 of Renthorp's senior present, because the Duke was not a reckless man, and had no intention of leaving the meeting unwitnessed. Whitmore arrived from London 3 days later, brisk and precise and professionally delighted by the scale of what had been laid in front of him. Hilda gave him everything. The copied records she had kept folded in the lining of her winter coat. The archive documents she had catalogued over 11 months of patient Tuesday mornings when Crane made his weekly visit to the village, and the archive room was safely accessible. The letter from the late Duke, which the Duke of Renthorp retrieved himself from the study and placed on Whitmore's desk without a word. Whitmore spent 4 days working. On the 5th day, he came to the library where the Duke and Hilda were reviewing the property ledgers and said, without preamble, that what they had was not only sufficient but exceptional, and that in 30 years of practice he had rarely seen fraud this extensive or this precisely documented. He looked at Hilda when he said the last part. She did not allow herself to feel vindicated. Thomas deserved more than her vindication, but she allowed herself to feel, for the first time in 18 months, that the ground under her feet was solid. The Duke's evenings changed after Whitmore arrived. He had always worked late. She knew that from 11 months of observing the light under the library door, long after the household retired. But now the light stayed lit, and there were two voices behind it rather than one. And the housekeeper began leaving a supper tray outside the library at 9 o'clock because the Duke had apparently decided that meals were a secondary concern and someone needed to ensure he consumed them. Hilda was the one who brought the tray. She had not been asked to. She had simply begun doing it on the second evening because she was passing the kitchen and the tray was ready, and it seemed inefficient to send someone else. On the fourth evening, the Duke heard her set the tray down and said, without looking up from the document Whitmore was describing to him, "Sit down, Miss George." She sat. He finished the session with Whitmore, and Whitmore excused himself with the discretion of a man who had read the room accurately, and then it was the two of them, and the fire and the supper tray, and the comfortable quiet of people who have said enough important things to each other that silence no longer requires filling. He asked about Thomas, not the case, not the evidence, but Thomas himself, who he had been, what he had wanted, whether he had been funny or serious or somewhere between. She told him. She had not told anyone in 18 months, not really, because the people around her knew Thomas only as a tragedy, and she had no interest in performing grief for an audience. But the Duke asked the way he asked everything, with his full attention directed toward her voice, and she found that she had a great deal to say. She asked about his father. Not the forgery, not the letter, but the man. He told her, with a restraint that gradually loosened over 3 evenings until she understood, that the late Duke of Renthorp had been brilliant and difficult, and had loved his son in the compressed, insufficient way of men, who were never taught that love required expression as well as feeling. The current Duke had inherited the title at 23, and the grief at the same moment, and had never been given adequate space to separate them. On the 9th evening he said, "You are 22. She looked up from the ledger she was cross-referencing. "Yes. How did you?" Whitmore mentioned it when reviewing the inquest documents. "Thomas George, 24. Sister 2 years younger." He paused. "I am 28. I want you to know that, since I know your age." She looked at him across the desk and thought that this was a very precise and deliberate thing to say, and that he was a very precise and deliberate man, and that the information had been offered in a particular way that she was choosing not to examine too closely at this moment. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, which was entirely inadequate, and she knew it. He was fairly certain of it. Crane was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the document had gone unsigned. Whitmore had coordinated with a senior court in London, bypassing the county magistrate entirely, and the arrest was conducted by officers who had no history with Crane and no interest in his connections. 3 counts of fraud, 2 of forgery, and 1 charge relating to the investigation into Thomas George's death. Not a conviction, not yet, but an investigation formally reopened with the weight of a London court behind it. It was not everything. It was enough. The morning after the arrest, Hilda packed her bag. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the room she had occupied for 11 months, and she told herself clearly that the case was concluded. The purpose she had come here for was complete, and that remaining any longer was sentimental in a way she could not justify and would not indulge. She told herself this with conviction. She believed it completely, right up until she reached the entrance hall and found the Duke at the bottom of the stairs. He had heard her come down. He heard everything. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he oriented himself toward her with that particular accuracy that she had stopped, finding unsettling 2 months ago, and had since found simply true, simply him, simply the way he was present in a room. "You are leaving," he said. "The matter is concluded, Your Grace. I have no further." "I have asked you before," he said, "not to give me the practical reason when the real one is more honest." She closed her mouth. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had the quality she had come to know from late evenings in the library, the quality of a man who has removed the composure he wears for the world and is speaking from whatever is underneath it. "You came here for Thomas," he said. "You gave 11 months of your life to this house, in service to a purpose that required you to be invisible every day, inside the same walls as the man responsible for your brother's death. You did it with patience and precision, and a courage that I am aware most people would not have sustained. And when the moment came, when the document was on the desk and Crane's plan was one signature from completion, you chose to stop it rather than let it proceed and use it as evidence, 'cause letting it proceed would have harmed the tenant families." He stopped. "You gave up the cleanest possible proof in order to protect people you did not know. The case is strong without it," she said. "I know it is. That is not the point." He took one step forward. "You are 22 years old, and you are the most quietly formidable person I have encountered in 28 years. And the library at 9 o'clock in the evening has become entirely unbearable without someone on the other side of the desk. And I would like you to stay." He paused. "Not as a housemaid, as something accurate, something that begins with companion and reserves the right to become, over time, whatever we are honest enough to name." The hall was warm. The morning light came through the tall windows in long, pale bars. Somewhere beyond the walls, the household was beginning its day, and the estate was breathing, and the eastern and northern properties were still intact, still Renthorp's, and Thomas George's name was attached to a formal investigation rather than an accident record. Hilda George set her bag down on the marble floor. "I would need it to be a genuine title," she said. "Something that does not require me to carry trays." "I will speak to the housekeeper this afternoon," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had learned, over 9 evenings, to recognize as the expression that lived closest to a smile in a man who did not give them easily. She crossed the hall and stood beside him and offered her arm, because he had always, every time they walked anywhere together, waited for her to establish the direction. He took it, and they walked back through the marble corridors of Renthorp Hall, into the library, into the light of a morning that was, finally, exactly what it appeared to be. If you have stayed with Hilda and the Duke until this last line, you already know that this is the kind of story that does not let go easily. A brother who deserved better, a sister who made sure he got it, and a man who spent 2 years being managed by a trusted voice, and finally learned to listen to a different one. If this story found you, like this video and tell us in the comments, at what moment did you stop breathing for a second? We read every single one. Subscribe, because every week we come back to these rooms and these fires and these people who chose something true when it would have been so much easier to choose something safe. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the right kind of courage is quiet and patient and does not announce itself until the moment it is needed most. Thank you for being here.